The blood dripped onto the floorboards before Sarah Sinclair even noticed her palms had split open again, the raw flesh screaming as she gripped the heavy iron pot one more time to hoist it onto the stove of the boarding house kitchen, where she worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, in Julesburg, Colorado, during the unforgiving spring of 1878. She had been doing this for 3 months now, ever since her father died of pneumonia and left her completely alone in the world with nothing but debts to repay and a reputation to uphold. And though she was only 19 years old, Sarah felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with exhaustion that settled into bones like sediment at the bottom of a river. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Hutchins, was a hard woman who believed that idle hands were the devil's workshop. So Sarah scrubbed, cooked, cleaned, hauled water, chopped wood, and did everything else required to keep the establishment running from before dawn until well past midnight. Her hands had been soft once, the hands of a girl whose father had promised her a good education and a comfortable life. But those promises died with him, and now her palms were a landscape of blisters, calluses, and open wounds that never quite healed because there was always another pot to lift, another floor to scrub, another impossible task that could not wait. The pain was so constant that Sarah had learned to breathe through it, to let it become background noise like the sound of wagon wheels on the muddy street outside, or the endless chatter of the boarders, who never seemed to notice that the girl who served their meals was slowly destroying herself one task at a time. She wrapped her hands in whatever scraps of cloth she could find, but the fabric always soaked through with blood and had to be changed. And Mrs. Hutchins complained about the waste of good material that could be used for something more profitable. The other girls who worked at the boarding house whispered that Sarah was killing herself with work, but none of them offered to help because they had their own burdens to carry and their own fears about ending up on the street if they displeased Mrs. Hutchins. So Sarah kept working, kept bleeding, kept pushing herself past the point where her body begged her to stop, because stopping meant losing her position. And losing her position meant starvation or worse in a frontier town, where women without protection were vulnerable to every kind of predator that walked on 2 legs. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed, though Sarah would not realize the significance until much later. She was outside behind the boarding house, using an axe to split wood for the evening fires, and her hands were so slippery with blood that the handle kept sliding in her grip. She had wrapped them that morning in strips torn from an old petticoat, but the fabric was completely saturated now, dark red stains spreading across the pale cotton like ink on paper. The axe came down again and again, each impact sending shockwaves of agony up her arms, but the woodpile needed to be replenished, and there was no one else to do it. Mrs. Hutchins had sent the other girls into town on errands, leaving Sarah alone with her pain and her stubborn determination to finish what needed to be finished. She did not hear him approach, this man who would change everything, because the sound of the axe hitting would drown out his footsteps. When she finally looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead with her forearm and leaving a smear of blood across her temple, she found herself staring at the largest human being she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun, and his arms were thick with muscle that showed clearly beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his worn flannel shirt. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered and tanned from years of living outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention most, pale blue like glacier ice, and they were fixed on her bleeding hands with an expression she could not quite read. "You are hurting yourself," he said, and his voice was deep and rough like gravel, with an accent that suggested he had not been born in America, but had lived here long enough to master the language. Sarah looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, then back up at the stranger. "I am working," she said simply, because there was no other explanation needed. "You are bleeding," he corrected, taking a step closer. He moved with surprising grace for someone so large, like a mountain cat she had once seen prowling near the edge of town. "That is not working. That is destroying yourself." "I do not have a choice," Sarah said, and hated how her voice wavered slightly, betraying the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. "The wood needs splitting." "Then I will split it," the man said, reaching out to take the axe from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, and she gasped at the contact, not from pain but from the unexpected gentleness of his touch. "You will sit down and rest." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that Mrs. Hutchins would be furious if she found a stranger doing Sarah's work, wanted to explain that she could not afford to rest, because rest meant weakness and weakness meant failure. But the man was already taking the axe from her unresisting hands, and something in his steady gaze told her that arguing would be pointless. So she sat down on an overturned bucket, watching as he positioned himself in front of the chopping block and swung the axe with effortless power. The blade split the log cleanly in two, and he reached for another piece without pausing. "What is your name?" Sarah asked after a moment, because sitting in silence felt strange and uncomfortable. "Connor Vaughn," he said, not looking at her as he worked. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and she noticed that he handled the tool with the ease of long practice. "I am a trapper. I bring furs to trade in Julesburg every few months." "Sarah Sinclair," she replied, then added because it seemed important somehow, "I work here at the boarding house." "I can see that," Connor said, and there was something in his tone that might have been sympathy or might have been anger, though she could not tell which or who it was directed at. "How long have your hands been like that?" Sarah looked down at the blood-soaked wrappings and felt a wave of shame wash over her. "A while," she admitted quietly. "They heal some during the night, but then the work starts again and they open up." Connor stopped chopping and turned to face her fully, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch in her throat. "That is not right," he said flatly. "Someone should not have to work until they bleed." "Life is not always right," Sarah said, and heard the bitterness in her own voice. "It just is what it is." He studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to see past her defenses to the exhaustion and desperation beneath. Then he nodded once, as if making a decision. "Wait here," he said. And before she could ask where he was going, he had disappeared around the corner of the building with the same silent grace he had arrived with. Sarah sat on the bucket, listening to the sounds of the town around her, the shouts of teamsters driving their wagons through the muddy streets, the laughter from the saloon 2 buildings over, the distant whistle of a train approaching the station. Her hands throbbed in time with her heartbeat, and she wondered what Mrs. Hutchins would say when she found out that Sarah had let a stranger split the wood. Nothing good, probably, but Sarah found that she could not quite bring herself to care at that moment. The brief rest felt like heaven, like something she had forgotten existed in the relentless grind of her days. Connor returned carrying a leather saddlebag, and he knelt down in front of her with a smoothness that belied his size. "Let me see your hands," he said, and it was not quite a command but not quite a request either. Sarah hesitated, then slowly unwrapped the blood-soaked cloth from her right hand. The skin underneath was raw and angry, with deep cracks across her palm and at the base of each finger. Some of the wounds were fresh and bleeding, while others had started to scab over only to be torn open again by the day's work. Connor's jaw tightened as he looked at her hand, and she saw his fingers curl into fists for a moment, before he deliberately relaxed them. "This is very bad," he said quietly. "You could get infection. You could lose use of your hands if this continues." "I know," Sarah whispered, because she did know, had been terrified of exactly that possibility every night when she lay in her narrow bed in the attic and felt her hands pulse with pain. "But I have to work. I have to pay off my father's debts, and I have to keep my position here, or I will have nowhere to go." Connor opened his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin and a roll of clean white cloth. "I am going to clean these wounds and bandage them properly," he told her. "It will hurt, but it will help them heal, and you are going to rest them as much as you can." "I cannot rest them," Sarah protested weakly. "Mrs. Hutchins needs me to work. There is too much to do." "Then Mrs. Hutchins will have to accept less," Connor said firmly. He opened the tin, revealing a pale salve that smelled of herbs and something sharp like alcohol. "Your health is more important than her convenience." Sarah wanted to explain that it was not about convenience, that it was about survival, that women like her did not have the luxury of putting their health first. But Connor was already applying the salve to her palm with fingers that were surprisingly gentle, despite their size and roughness, and the sensation was so overwhelming that she could not speak. The salve stung at first, making her eyes water, but then a cooling numbness spread across her skin, and the constant pain receded to a dull ache. He worked in silence, coating every wound and crack with the salve before wrapping her hand in the clean cloth with expert precision. Then he repeated the process with her left hand, and Sarah found herself watching his face as he worked. There was a concentration in his expression, a care and attention that she had not received from anyone since her father died. When he finished, both her hands were wrapped in pristine white bandages that felt like clouds compared to the rough, blood-soaked rags she had been using. "Thank you," Sarah said, and her voice came out hoarse with emotion she could not quite suppress. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Connor replied, closing the tin of salve and putting it back in his saddlebag. "And I will come back tomorrow to check on you and change the bandages. You need to rest your hands as much as possible. No heavy lifting, no chopping wood, no scrubbing floors." "I cannot do that," Sarah said desperately. "Mrs. Hutchins will fire me if I refuse to work." Connor stood up, his full height suddenly very intimidating. "Then I will speak with Mrs. Hutchins," he said. "She will understand that you need time to heal, or she will find out that the people of Julesburg do not look kindly on those who work young girls until they are crippled." Sarah felt a flutter of fear in her chest. "Please do not make trouble," she begged. "I need this position. I have nowhere else to go." He looked down at her, and his expression softened slightly. "I am not going to make trouble," he said. "I am going to make sure you are treated fairly. There is a difference." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Hutchins emerged from the back door of the boarding house, her face pinched with suspicion. "Sarah Sinclair, who is this man and why are you sitting idle?" she demanded. "There is work to be done." Connor turned to face her, and Sarah saw Mrs. Hutchins take an involuntary step backward at the sight of him. "My name is Connor Vaughn," he said in that deep, gravelly voice. "Sarah has injured her hands badly from overwork. I have bandaged them, but she needs to rest them for at least a week, or they may never heal properly." Mrs. Hutchins' eyes narrowed. "Sarah's hands are her own concern," she said coldly, "and her work is mine. I pay her wages and she owes me her labor in return." "You pay her wages to work, not to destroy herself," Connor countered, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "If she cannot use her hands, she will be no good to anyone. A week of rest now will save you from losing a worker permanently." The two of them stared at each other, and Sarah held her breath. certain that this confrontation would end with her losing her position and being thrown out onto the street. But something in Connor's immovable presence seemed to give Mrs. Hutchins pause. She was a practical woman above all else, and Sarah could see her calculating the truth in his words. "Fine," Mrs. Hutchins said at last, her lips pressed into a thin line. "1 week. But she will still be expected to do light work, things that do not require heavy use of her hands." "I am running a business, not a charity." "That is fair," Connor agreed. "Thank you for being reasonable." Mrs. Hutchins sniffed, clearly not appreciating the compliment, and turned her sharp gaze on Sarah. "Get inside and start preparing vegetables for tonight's supper. You can use a knife carefully, even with bandaged hands. And do not think this means you can slack off, girl. You still have a debt to pay." She swept back inside, leaving Sarah and Connor alone in the yard once more. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs trembling slightly from the strain of the day and the stress of the confrontation. "Thank you," she said again, looking up at Connor with gratitude and confusion warring in her chest. "But why did you do that? You do not know me." Connor picked up his saddlebag and slung it over his shoulder. "I know that no one should have to work until they bleed," he said simply. "And I know that sometimes people need someone to stand up for them when they cannot stand up for themselves." He paused, then added, "I will come by tomorrow morning to check your bandages and bring more salve. Make sure you keep them clean and dry as much as possible." "You do not have to do that," Sarah protested weakly, though part of her desperately hoped he would anyway. "I know," Connor said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that might have been a smile. "But I will do it anyway. Rest your hands, Sarah Sinclair. Let them heal." Then he was gone, walking away with that same easy grace, and Sarah stood in the yard feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. She looked down at her bandaged hands, so clean and white, and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, because tears were a luxury she could not afford, and went inside to prepare vegetables for supper with her newly bandaged hands that hurt less than they had in months. The week that followed was strange and wonderful in equal measure. Connor came every morning just after dawn, before the boarding house was fully awake, and he would find Sarah in the kitchen or the backyard and check her hands with the same gentle care he had shown that first day. He brought fresh bandages and more of the healing salve, and he always asked her how she was feeling, if she was resting enough, if Mrs. Hutchins was working her too hard. Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her, because she had learned not to depend on anyone after her father died, and depending on Connor felt dangerous in ways she could not quite articulate. He told her about his life in the mountains, how he trapped beaver and fox and lived alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands, how he preferred the company of the wilderness to the crowds and noise of town. Sarah listened with fascination, trying to imagine what it must be like to live in such isolation and freedom, so different from her own existence of endless work and constant supervision. Connor asked about her life too, and she told him about her father, about the debts he had left behind, about her dreams of maybe one day saving enough money to start a small business of her own, though she knew it was unlikely to ever happen. On the third day of his visits, Connor brought her something wrapped in cloth. "I made these for you," he said, handing her the bundle with an awkwardness that seemed out of place on someone so large and confident. Sarah unwrapped the cloth carefully and found a pair of leather gloves, soft and supple, lined with sheepskin for comfort. They were clearly handmade, the stitching careful and even, and they fit her hands perfectly when she slipped them on over the bandages. "These are beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "You made them yourself. I make most of my own things in the mountains, Connor said, looking away as if embarrassed by her praise. I thought they would help protect your hands when you have to work. The leather is thick enough to cushion against tools and rough surfaces. Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine and everything to do with the man standing before her. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." Connor looked back at her then, and his pale blue eyes were intense. "You deserve kindness, Sarah," he said. "You deserve to be treated as something more than a work animal." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Sarah did not have a name for, and then Mrs. Hutchins called from inside the house, and the spell was broken. Connor stepped back, nodding to her in farewell, and Sarah went inside with her heart beating faster than it should. By the end of the week, Sarah's hands had improved dramatically. The cracks had closed, the raw flesh had begun to heal, and though her palms were still tender, the constant agony had faded to occasional twinges. Connor pronounced himself satisfied with her progress, but he continued to come by each morning anyway, always with some excuse about wanting to make sure the healing continued or bringing her another tin of salve to keep on hand. Sarah did not question these excuses, because she had come to treasure their early morning conversations more than she should, more than was wise for someone in her precarious position. On the 10th day after their first meeting, Connor asked her to go for a walk with him. "It is Sunday," he pointed out. "You have Sunday afternoons off, correct? Come with me, I want to show you something." Sarah hesitated, aware of how it would look if she was seen walking out with a man unchaperoned, but the hope in Connor's eyes decided her. "All right," she agreed. "But I need to finish the lunch dishes first." "I will wait," Connor said simply, and he did, sitting patiently on a bench in the yard while Sarah rushed through her afternoon chores with her gloved hands working more efficiently than they had in months. He led her out of town, following a path that wound along the creek that gave Julesburg its water. The day was warm and bright, with cotton clouds drifting across a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Sarah walked beside Connor, acutely aware of his presence, of how small she felt next to his size and strength, of how safe she felt in a way that had nothing to do with physical protection, and everything to do with the quiet steadiness he radiated. They walked for perhaps half an hour before Connor stopped at a place where the creek widened into a small pool, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided dappled shade. The water was clear and cool, reflecting the sky above, and wildflowers grew in profusion along the banks. It was peaceful in a way that the boarding house never was, the only sounds being the burble of water over stones and the songs of birds in the trees. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "How did you find this place?" "I explore whenever I come to town," Connor said, leaning against one of the cottonwood trees and watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "I do not like being confined to buildings and streets. I need space around me, room to breathe." Sarah understood that feeling more than she could say. She moved closer to the water's edge, careful not to slip on the damp grass, and looked down at her reflection in the pool. She saw a thin girl with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a plain brown dress that had been patched multiple times, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She barely recognized herself anymore. When had she become so worn down, so diminished? "What are you thinking?" Connor asked, coming to stand beside her. Sarah considered lying, then decided he deserved honesty. "I am thinking that I do not like what I see in my reflection," she admitted. "I am thinking that I have let myself become someone I do not recognize." "I see someone strong," Connor said quietly. I see someone who has endured hardship and kept going when most people would have given up. I see someone who deserves so much more than she has been given." Sarah turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his face made her throat tighten with emotion. "You barely know me," she whispered. "How can you see all that?" "I know enough," Connor replied. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I know that you work harder than anyone should have to. I know that you push yourself past your limits because you think you have no other choice. I know that you are brave and determined and deserving of care and rest and kindness." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she was mortified by her own weakness. "I am sorry," she said, trying to turn away, but Connor caught her other hand gently. "Do not apologize for feeling," he said firmly. "You have been holding everything inside for too long. Let it out. There is no shame in tears." So she cried, standing by that peaceful pool with Connor's hand holding hers, and she cried for her father and for her lost dreams and for all the pain she had been carrying alone for so long. Connor did not try to stop her or tell her everything would be fine. He just stood there, solid and present, until the tears finally slowed and then stopped. "Thank you," Sarah said when she could speak again, her voice rough from crying. "I did not know I needed that." "Everyone needs to cry sometimes," Connor said, "even mountain men." That startled a laugh out of her, watery and weak but genuine. "Have you cried recently?" she asked. "Not recently," Connor admitted, "but I have cried. When my mother died, I cried for days. When I first came to the mountains and thought I would die of loneliness, I cried then too. Tears are not weakness. They are just proof that you are human." They sat down together on the grass near the pool's edge, and Sarah found herself leaning slightly against Connor's shoulder, drawn to his warmth and solidity. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears in a way that felt both natural and extraordinary. Connor told her about growing up in Norway and immigrating to America when he was 17, about learning to survive in the wilderness, about the satisfaction of living a life governed by his own rules and rhythms. Sarah told him about her childhood, about her mother who had died when Sarah was 10, about her father's struggles to provide for her after that, about her own hope to one day have a home and a family of her own. "You will have that," Connor said with quiet certainty. "You will have everything you dream of and more." "How can you be so sure?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. Connor met her gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Because I intend to give it to you," he said simply. "If you will let me." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I am saying that I want to court you properly," Connor said. "I am saying that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the first moment I saw you with your bleeding hands and your stubborn determination. I am saying that I want to take care of you, protect you, give you the life you deserve." He paused, then added with devastating honesty, "I am saying that I am falling in love with you, Sarah Sinclair, and I want to know if you might feel the same way about me." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. She had known Connor for less than 2 weeks. She should tell him that this was too fast, too sudden, that they barely knew each other. But the truth was that she did feel the same way. Something about Connor had reached past all her defenses from that very first moment. And the past 10 days had only deepened her feelings until she found herself thinking about him constantly, looking forward to his morning visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. "I do," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "I do feel the same way, but Connor, I have nothing to offer you. I am in debt, I have no prospects, I work at a boarding house because I have nowhere else to go. You deserve someone better than me." Connor's expression hardened. "Do not say that," he said firmly. "You have everything to offer. You have courage and strength and kindness. You have a beautiful heart despite everything you have been through. That is worth more than any amount of money or status." He took both her hands in his, careful of her still healing palms, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Let me take care of you," he said softly. "Let me give you rest and peace and a home where you do not have to work until you bleed. Come with me to my cabin in the mountains. Marry me, Sarah. Be my wife." Sarah's mind spun with the impossibility and the overwhelming rightness of what he was offering. "Your cabin in the mountains." She repeated, "But I thought you lived alone, that you preferred solitude." "I did prefer it until I met you," Connor said. "Now the thought of going back to that cabin alone feels unbearable. I want you there with me. I want to wake up every morning to your face. I want to spend my days showing you the beauty of the wilderness and my nights holding you in my arms. I want to build a life with you." "But the mountains are so isolated," Sarah said, trying to think practically even as her heart sang with hope. "What if you grow tired of having me there? What if I cannot adapt to that kind of life?" "You will adapt because you are strong and capable," Connor said with absolute confidence. "And I will never grow tired of you. Sarah, I have lived alone for 8 years. I know what solitude feels like. This is not that. This is finding the one person who makes everything else make sense." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his so large and scarred and capable, hers small and still healing but protected now by the gloves he had made for her. She thought about her life at the boarding house, the endless work and exhaustion and loneliness. She thought about Mrs. Hutchins and the debt that would take years to repay if she stayed here. Then she thought about waking up in a cabin in the mountains, about having someone who cared for her well-being, about building a life with this remarkable man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers. She had not known how to pray. "Yes," she said, looking back up at Connor with tears in her eyes again, but happy tears this time. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want to come with you to the mountains. Yes to all of it." The smile that spread across Connor's face was like sunrise, transforming his rugged features into something radiant. He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah went willingly, feeling his strength surround her like a shield against all the hardships of the world. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile, and Sarah kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and hope she had been carrying in her heart. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Connor rested his forehead against hers. "We will need to do this properly," he said. "I will speak to Mrs. Hutchins about your debt and arrange to pay it off. We will be married by the pastor in town before we leave for the mountains. I want to do everything right so that you never have any regrets." "I could never regret this," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." They stayed by the pool until the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Then they walked back to town hand in hand, and Sarah felt as though she were floating rather than walking, her heart so full of happiness it felt like it might burst. The next morning, Connor went to speak with Mrs. Hutchins about Sarah's debt. Sarah was not present for the conversation, but she heard about it afterward from one of the other girls who had been cleaning the hallway outside Mrs. Hutchins' office. Apparently, Connor had offered to pay off Sarah's father's debt in full, plus an additional sum for the inconvenience of losing a worker on short notice. Mrs. Hutchins had tried to demand even more, but Connor had stood his ground with the same immovable calm he brought to everything, and eventually Mrs. Hutchins had accepted his offer with ill grace. When Sarah heard the news, she sought out Connor where he was waiting in the boarding house parlor. "You paid my debt," she said, her voice shaking. "Connor, that must have cost you months of earnings from your trapping." "It was worth every penny," Connor said simply. You are free now, Sarah. Free of debt, free of obligation, free to start a new life." Sarah threw her arms around him, not caring who saw or what they might think. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for everything." They were married 4 days later on a bright Thursday morning in late April in the small church at the edge of Julesburg. Sarah wore a new dress that Connor had purchased for her, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and she felt like a princess in it after years of wearing nothing but faded browns and grays. Connor wore clean trousers and a white shirt, and he had trimmed his hair and beard so that he looked almost civilized, though nothing could entirely tame the wildness that seemed to cling to him like mountain mist. The pastor who married them was an elderly man named Reverend Thompson, who had known Sarah's father and seemed genuinely pleased to see Sarah finding happiness after so much hardship. The ceremony was simple and brief, with only a handful of people in attendance, but when Connor slipped a gold ring onto Sarah's finger and promised to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives, she felt the weight and truth of those words settle into her bones like roots growing deep. "I love you," she whispered when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. "I love you so much, Connor Vaughn." "I love you too, Sarah Vaughn," Connor replied, and the sound of her new name made her smile so wide her cheeks hurt. Then he kissed her, and the handful of witnesses applauded, and Sarah knew that this was the beginning of something extraordinary. They left Julesburg that same afternoon, with Sarah riding on a gentle mare that Connor had purchased for her and Connor on his own large stallion. Sarah had only a few possessions to bring with her, clothes and a few books and a locket that had belonged to her mother, all packed into saddlebags that seemed pitifully small to represent her entire previous life. But she did not feel sad about leaving. She felt liberated, as though she had been carrying an enormous weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. The journey to Connor's cabin took 3 days of steady riding through terrain that grew progressively more rugged and wild. They followed old game trails up into the mountains, through forests of pine and aspen, past streams that ran clear and cold with snowmelt. Connor pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the region, about the Ute people who had lived here long before white settlers arrived, about the wildlife that populated these mountains, about the changing seasons, and how to read the weather in the clouds and wind. Sarah absorbed all of it with fascination, feeling her perspective shift and expand with every mile they traveled away from civilization. She had lived her entire life in towns, surrounded by buildings and people and the constant noise of human activity. Out here, the silence was profound, broken only by natural sounds. Wind through trees, water over rocks, the calls of birds and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. It should have been frightening, but instead Sarah found it peaceful in a way that made her realize how tense she had been for years, how constantly braced against the next hardship. They camped each night under the stars, and Connor showed her how to set up a proper camp, how to build a fire that would burn hot and clean, how to cook simple meals over the flames. He was patient with her inexperience, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were second nature to him. And when they lay down to sleep in their bedrolls spread close together, Connor held her in his arms and made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since childhood. On the third night, as they lay together watching the stars wheel overhead, Sarah asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Connor, are you sure you want me to stay with you year-round? I know many trappers only live in their cabins during the winter trapping season and spend summers in town." Connor tightened his arms around her. "I live in my cabin year-round," he said. "The mountains are my home, not town. And yes, I am absolutely sure I want you with me always." I did not marry you to have a part-time wife, Sarah. I married you to have a partner, a companion, someone to share my life with in all seasons. What will I do all day while you are checking your trap lines? Sarah asked, voicing another concern. Whatever you wish, Connor said. Tend the garden I planted last year. Keep the cabin clean and comfortable. Read your books. Explore the area around the cabin. Learn new skills. Rest and heal and remember what it feels like to not be exhausted all the time. He paused, then added softly, You do not have to earn your place with me through constant work, Sarah. You have value simply by existing. I want you to learn that. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again, still not quite able to believe that this was real, that she had truly found someone who valued her as more than just a pair of working hands. I will try, she whispered, but you may need to remind me sometimes. I have been working like that for so long, I do not know how to stop. Then I will remind you every single day if necessary, Connor promised, kissing the top of her head. Rest now. We will reach the cabin tomorrow afternoon. The cabin was not what Sarah had expected. She had pictured something rough and primitive, perhaps little more than a shack. But when they finally rode up to it in the late afternoon of the third day, she saw a solidly built structure of logs chinked with clay, with a stone chimney rising from one end and real glass windows that caught the sunlight. There was a covered porch across the front, a small barn and corral for the horses, and a cleared area that showed the remnants of last year's garden. You built all this yourself? Sarah asked in amazement as Connor helped her down from her mare. Over several years, Connor confirmed. I started with just the main cabin, then added the barn and porch later. It is not fancy, but it is solid and weatherproof. Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping area at one end, a kitchen area with a good iron stove at the other, and a living space in the middle with a table, chairs, and even a rocking chair positioned near the stone fireplace. The walls were hung with furs and tools, and there were shelves holding books and supplies. Everything was neat and organized, showing Connor's methodical nature. It is wonderful, Sarah said honestly, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. It is so much more than I expected. It is your home now, too, Connor said, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. You can change anything you want, arrange things however you like. I want you to be comfortable here. Sarah leaned back against his solid chest, feeling his heart beat steadily against her spine. I am already comfortable, she said, because I am with you. They spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, with Connor showing Sarah where everything was kept and how the various systems of the cabin worked. He had a clever arrangement for collecting rainwater, a cold storage area built into the hillside behind the cabin, and a smokehouse for preserving meat. Sarah was impressed by how self-sufficient the setup was, how much thought Connor had put into making this place livable. That evening, they ate a simple supper of beans and bacon, and afterward they sat together on the porch watching the sun set behind the peaks to the west. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the temperature dropped rapidly as it always did in the mountains. Connor wrapped a blanket around Sarah's shoulders and pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder with a contentment that felt almost foreign after so many years of stress and struggle. Are you happy? Connor asked quietly. Happier than I have been in years, Sarah answered honestly. Happier than I ever thought I could be. Good, Connor said, and she heard the satisfaction in his voice. That is all I want, to make you happy and keep you safe. Their first weeks together in the cabin established the rhythms of their new life. Connor rose early each morning to check his trap lines, which were spread out over several miles of mountainside. Sarah woke when he did, preparing coffee and breakfast for both of them, learning to use the iron stove efficiently. After Connor left for the day, Sarah tackled various projects around the cabin and property, but she was careful not to overwork her hands, remembering Connor's warning and the way he checked them each evening to make sure they continued to heal properly. She cleaned and organized the cabin, making small improvements and adding feminine touches that Connor praised effusively, even when they were objectively minor things like curtains for the windows or a tablecloth for the table. She worked in the garden, turning over the soil and planting seeds that Connor had brought back from his last trip to town: beans, squash, corn, potatoes, carrots. She learned to bake bread in the cabin's oven, to churn butter, to preserve food for the winter months ahead. But more than any specific task, Sarah learned to rest. Connor was relentless about this, always watching to make sure she did not push herself too hard, always encouraging her to take breaks, to sit in the rocking chair with a book, to walk through the forest surrounding the cabin just for the pleasure of it. At first, Sarah felt guilty about resting, as though she should be constantly productive to justify her place there. But Connor was patient, reminding her repeatedly that she had value beyond her ability to work, that he wanted her healthy and happy more than he wanted her productive. Slowly, over days and then weeks, Sarah felt something in her begin to unfurl like a flower that had been closed tight against harsh weather. The constant exhaustion that had been her companion for so long began to fade, replaced by genuine energy and vitality. Her hands healed completely, the cracks and blisters disappearing to leave only slightly thickened skin where the worst wounds had been. She began to sleep through the night without waking, to wake naturally with the sun rather than from nightmares or anxiety. She began to remember what it felt like to be young, to have dreams and hopes for the future rather than just grinding through each day. And through all of it, Connor was her anchor and her strength. He was patient with her learning curve, teaching her skills she needed for mountain life without ever making her feel inadequate. He was affectionate and attentive, always ready with a kind word or a gentle touch or a kiss that made her forget whatever task she was working on. He was protective in the best possible way, watching out for her safety without being controlling or possessive. In the evenings, after supper was done and the dishes washed, they would sit together and talk for hours. Connor taught Sarah to identify different types of animal tracks, to read the signs of changing weather, to understand the patterns of the seasons in the mountains. Sarah read aloud from her books, sharing stories and poems with Connor, who listened with surprising interest given his rough exterior. They talked about their pasts, their dreams for the future, their thoughts on everything from religion to politics to the best way to cook venison. And at night, in the bed that Connor had built with his own hands, they came together with a passion that surprised them both. Connor was always gentle with Sarah, mindful of her smaller size and her inexperience, but there was an intensity to their lovemaking that spoke of the deep connection growing between them. Sarah had been nervous the first time, but Connor had been patient and careful, making sure she felt nothing but pleasure. And now she found herself craving his touch with an eagerness that would have shocked her previous self. Summer arrived in full force, turning the mountains into a paradise of green forests and wildflower-covered meadows. Connor took Sarah on long walks, showing her hidden waterfalls and pristine alpine lakes, teaching her the names of the plants and animals they encountered. He taught her to fish in the cold mountain streams, and she laughed with delight the first time she successfully caught a trout. He showed her where to find wild berries and edible plants, expanding their diet beyond the garden and preserved foods. One particularly memorable day in late June, Connor took Sarah to a high meadow that was completely covered in purple and yellow wildflowers. They had a picnic lunch sitting on a blanket in the sunshine, surrounded by beauty so profound it made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. After they ate, they lay back on the blanket and watched clouds drift across the brilliant blue sky, and Connor told her stories about his childhood in Norway, about mountains even more dramatic than these, about growing up in a fishing village and learning to respect the power of nature. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked, turning on her side to look at him. "Norway, I mean, your family and your homeland." Connor was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I miss my mother," he admitted. "She was a good woman, strong and kind, but the rest of it, no. I do not miss the hunger or the cold or the feeling that I would never be able to rise above the circumstances of my birth. Here in America, in these mountains, I am free to be whoever I choose to be. That is worth more than any homeland." "I understand that," Sarah said softly. "I feel the same way about my life at the boarding house. I do not miss any of it except my father, but even that pain is fading now, becoming more memory than wound." Connor reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We are building something new together," he said. "Something that is ours alone, not dependent on where we came from or what we have lost. That is a powerful thing, Sarah." "It is," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "And I am so grateful for it, for you, for this life we are creating." They stayed in that meadow until late afternoon, and when they finally rode back to the cabin as evening approached, Sarah felt more complete and whole than she had ever felt in her entire life. As summer progressed, Sarah's confidence in her new life grew. She became proficient at the various tasks required to maintain the cabin and garden, to preserve food for winter, to care for the horses and chickens that Connor kept. But more importantly, she became comfortable with herself, with the idea that she had worth beyond her ability to work herself into exhaustion. Connor's constant affirmation and care had healed something deep inside her that had been damaged by her time at the boarding house, by the loss of her father, by years of struggling just to survive. In early August, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been entirely sure until the morning sickness began in earnest. She decided to tell Connor one evening after supper, nervous about how he might react even though she knew logically that he would be pleased. "Connor," she said as they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, his expression immediately concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Sarah assured him quickly. "Better than fine, actually." "Connor, I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment Connor just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a grin spread across his face, so wide and joyful that Sarah felt her own smile answering it. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the words. "Sarah, that is wonderful. That is the best news I have ever heard." He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she had suddenly become fragile. "When?" he asked. "I think probably late winter or early spring," Sarah said. "February or March, maybe." Connor pulled back to look at her face, his eyes bright with emotion. "You are sure you are all right? You are not sick? You are not having any problems, just morning sickness," Sarah said. "But that is normal, Connor. I am healthy and strong. We are going to be fine." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathless. "I am going to take such good care of you," Connor promised. "You are going to rest and eat well and not overwork yourself. I am going to make sure you and our baby have everything you need." "I know you will," Sarah said, laughing at his intensity. "You already take such good care of me. I have never been healthier or happier in my life." The months that followed were some of the happiest Sarah had ever known. As her belly grew and the baby inside her became more real and tangible, she found herself filled with a joy she had not known was possible. Connor was endlessly solicitous, always making sure she was comfortable, always bringing her little gifts from his excursions into the mountains. Interesting stones, beautiful feathers, bunches of wildflowers that he arranged clumsily in jars of water. They spent long evenings planning for the baby, deciding where the cradle would go, talking about names, imagining what their child would be like. Connor was determined that they would have a son, though he swore he would be equally happy with a daughter. Sarah privately hoped for a healthy baby regardless of sex, but she enjoyed Connor's enthusiasm and speculation. Autumn came to the mountains in a blaze of gold and orange as the aspen trees turned. Sarah helped Connor with the harvest from the garden and with preserving meat and fish for the long winter ahead. She was slower now with her pregnancy, but she was careful to pace herself and rest frequently, mindful of Connor's constant reminders not to overwork. Her hands, fully healed now and protected by the gloves Connor had made, no longer hurt even with extended work. Winter arrived in November with the first heavy snowfall, transforming the mountains into a wonderland of white. Connor had prepared well, and the cabin was warm and snug, with plenty of firewood stacked under the porch and stores of food that would easily see them through until spring. He still checked his trap lines, but the distances were shorter now with snow on the ground, and he was never gone for more than a few hours at a time, reluctant to leave Sarah alone for long as her pregnancy advanced. On a cold night in late February, with snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in the fireplace, Sarah went into labor. She had been feeling odd all day, with cramps that came and went, but she had not said anything to Connor because she was not sure if it was truly time. But when her water broke just after supper, there was no more doubt. Connor reacted with surprising calm, banking the fire and preparing the bed with clean linens, boiling water and laying out the supplies they had prepared for this moment. Sarah had worried about giving birth so far from town, with no doctor or midwife to assist, but Connor had delivered animals before and had read everything he could find about human childbirth during his last trip to town in the fall. "You are going to be fine," he told Sarah firmly as another contraction gripped her. "You are strong and healthy, and I am going to be right here with you through all of it." The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the early morning hours. Sarah had never experienced pain like this, waves of agony that seemed to consume her entire world. But Connor was true to his word, staying with her every moment, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, speaking words of encouragement and love. His steady presence gave her strength when she felt she had none left, his absolute confidence in her ability to do this carrying her through the worst of it. As dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered world outside in shades of pink and gold, Sarah gave birth to a son. Connor caught the baby in his large, capable hands, and the sound of that first cry was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. "A boy," Connor said, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Sarah's arms. "Sarah, we have a son." Sarah looked down at the tiny face of her baby, at his perfect features and his mop of dark hair, and felt love so overwhelming it made her previous understanding of the emotion seem pale and inadequate. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful boy." Connor sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Sarah and the other touching the baby's tiny hand with reverent gentleness. "What should we name him?" he asked. They had discussed many names, but suddenly Sarah knew exactly what this baby should be called. "Carl," she said, looking up at Connor. After my father, Carl Vaughn. Connor's eyes brightened with unshed tears. Carl, he repeated. That is perfect. Your father would be proud to have his grandson carry his name. The days that followed the birth were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning to care for this tiny dependent life that needed them for everything. Sarah was exhausted, but happy, marveling at the fact that she and Connor had created this perfect little person. Connor was a devoted father from the first moment, always ready to hold Carl when Sarah needed rest, to walk with him when he fussed, to change soiled cloths and help with all the messy, unglamorous parts of infant care that many men would have considered beneath them. As winter slowly gave way to spring, and the snow began to melt from the mountains, Carl grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert infant who smiled at his parents and made gurgling sounds that they both interpreted as early conversation. Sarah's body healed from the birth, and she found herself settling into the rhythms of motherhood with the same determination she had once applied to surviving at the boarding house, but now with joy instead of desperation. One warm afternoon in April, almost exactly a year since Connor had first bandaged Sarah's bleeding hands behind the Julesburg boarding house, they sat together on the porch with Carl sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Connor had one arm around her shoulders, and they watched the mountains slowly come back to life as spring advanced. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains to take on a wife and child?" Connor looked at her as if she had asked the most absurd question in the world. "Regret it," he repeated. "Sarah, you and Carl are the best things that have ever happened to me. Before I met you, I was just surviving, existing. But you gave me something to live for, a reason to build a future instead of just getting through each day. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. And Carl." He reached over to gently touch his son's cheek. "Carl is a miracle I never knew I wanted but now cannot imagine living without." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "You saved me, Connor. You saw me when I was at my lowest point, and you did not just help me. You gave me everything. A home, a family, a life worth living. You taught me that I have value beyond what I can produce with my hands." "You always had that value," Connor said firmly. "I just helped you see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen as afternoon moved toward evening. Then Carl stirred and woke, making the little hungry sounds that Sarah had learned to recognize. She adjusted her clothing to nurse him, still marveling at the fact that her body could nourish this small life. And Connor watched them both with an expression of such profound love and contentment that Sarah felt her heart might burst. Over the next few years, life in the cabin settled into a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. Carl grew from an infant into a toddler, then into a small boy who followed Connor around like a shadow, wanting to learn everything about trapping and hunting and living in the mountains. Sarah taught him his letters and numbers, reading to him from her books and telling him stories about his grandfather and about the world beyond their mountain home. When Carl was 3 years old, Sarah gave birth to another child, a daughter they named Susan after Sarah's mother. Susan had Connor's pale blue eyes and Sarah's dark hair, and she was as sweet-tempered as Carl had been fussy as an infant. Carl adored his baby sister from the first moment, always wanting to help care for her, to hold her and show her his treasures from the forest. Sarah's hands, which had once bled from overwork, were now strong and capable without being damaged. She used them to care for her children, to tend her garden, to cook and clean and sew, to hold her husband close on cold winter nights. The gloves Connor had made for her so long ago were worn now but carefully maintained, and she wore them for rough work as a reminder of how far she had come from that desperate girl splitting wood behind a boarding house in Julesburg. Connor continued trapping each winter, but he had also begun raising horses on a small scale, selling them to ranchers and townspeople when he made his twice-yearly trips to Julesburg for supplies. The income was good, and it meant he could spend more time at home with his family rather than ranging far and wide checking trap lines. He built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, adding a second room where the children could sleep and play. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, after the children were asleep in their own room, Connor and Sarah sat together on the porch as they had so many times before. The spring air was soft and warm, and the stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any artificial light. "Do you remember the day we met?" Connor asked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Of course," Sarah said, leaning into his warmth. "You saw me bleeding and decided to interfere." "Best decision I ever made," Connor said, "aside from convincing you to marry me." Sarah laughed softly. "You did not have to convince very hard. I was half in love with you from that first day, though I did not want to admit it to myself." "I was completely in love with you from the moment I saw you," Connor confessed. "The way you kept working even though you were in pain, your determination to keep going no matter what. You were magnificent, Sarah. You still are." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. "You gave me everything," she said softly. "A home, a family, a life I never thought I could have. You taught me to value myself. You gave me rest when I needed it most. You bandaged my wounds, both physical and emotional, and you made sure I healed properly." "You gave me just as much," Connor said firmly. "You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to be more than just a lonely man in the mountains. You gave me children and love and a real home instead of just a cabin to sleep in. We saved each other, Sarah." She could not argue with that, because it was true. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, two people who needed each other in ways neither had fully understood at the time. And from that first meeting behind a boarding house in Julesburg, they had built something extraordinary. A love that was deep and true, a family that was happy and healthy, a life that was rich with meaning and purpose. "To 5 more years," Sarah said, raising an imaginary glass. "And 50 more after that." "To forever," Connor corrected, pulling her closer and kissing her deeply. "Because forever is how long I intend to love you, Sarah Vaughn." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Carl grew into a strong boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did, who could track animals and read weather signs and handle horses with natural skill. Susan grew into a bright, curious girl who loved books and learning, who asked endless questions about everything and soaked up knowledge like a sponge. Sarah taught her children everything she knew, and Connor taught them everything he knew. And together they raised two capable, confident young people who were equally comfortable in wilderness and civilization. When Carl was 10 and Susan was 7, Sarah gave birth to twins, two healthy boys they named Thomas and Jack. The cabin was suddenly very crowded and very noisy, but it was also full of laughter and love. Connor built another addition, and Sarah organized their expanded household with the same determination she had once applied to surviving at the boarding house, but now with joy instead of desperation. Through it all, through busy years of childrearing and work and the daily tasks of life, Connor never forgot to watch over Sarah and make sure she was not overworking herself. He still checked her hands periodically, though there was no longer any need, and he still insisted that she rest when she needed it. And Sarah, who had once worked until her hands bled, had learned the lesson he taught her, that her value was not in how much she could produce, but in who she was, that rest was not laziness but necessity, that taking care of herself was not selfish but essential. On the 20th anniversary of the day, Connor had first bandaged Sarah's bleeding hands. They took a trip back to Julesburg, bringing all 4 children with them. The town had grown considerably, with a new bank and a hotel and even a telegraph office. The boarding house where Sarah had worked was still there, though Mrs. Hutchins had died several years earlier, and the new owner was much more reasonable about working conditions. They walked past the building, and Sarah felt no bitterness or anger, only a distant gratitude that those hard times had led her to Connor. They visited the church where they had been married, which looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier, and they stopped by Reverend Thompson's grave to pay their respects, because he had passed away the previous winter. But mostly they enjoyed introducing their children to the concept of town life, watching their wonder at the crowds and buildings and the general bustle of civilization. Carl and Susan were old enough to appreciate it, while the twins mostly just wanted to run around and explore everything. Connor bought gifts for everyone. A new book for Susan, a fine knife for Carl, wooden toys for the twins, and a beautiful shawl for Sarah made of wool so soft it felt like clouds. As they prepared to leave Julesburg and return to their mountain home, Sarah took one last look around the town where her old life had ended and her new life had begun. She thought about the girl she had been, exhausted and desperate and bleeding, and she thought about the woman she had become, healthy and happy and loved. The transformation was so complete that she could barely recognize her former self. Ready to go home? Connor asked, helping her up onto her horse while keeping one eye on the children who were already mounted and eager to start the journey. More than ready, Sarah said, smiling at him with all the love in her heart. Let us go home, Connor. Let us go back to our mountains. The ride back to the cabin took 4 days with the children, but it felt like a grand adventure rather than a hardship. They camped under the stars, and Connor taught the boys how to build a proper fire while Sarah and Susan prepared meals. They told stories and sang songs and laughed together as a family, and Sarah felt so full of contentment that she thought she might float away with it. When they finally arrived back at the cabin, nestled in its valley with mountains rising all around, Sarah felt the same sense of rightness and belonging she always felt when returning home. This was where she belonged, not in some dusty town but here in the wilderness with the man she loved and the family they had created together. The children scattered to check on their various possessions and projects, while Connor helped Sarah unload the pack horses. When everything was put away and the horses were settled in the barn, they stood together on the porch looking out at the familiar landscape that had become so dear to them both. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, taking Connor's hand in hers. "For what?" he asked, squeezing her fingers gently. "For everything," Sarah said. "For seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. For bandaging my hands and making sure I rested. For giving me a home and a family and a life beyond my wildest dreams. For loving me even when I did not know how to love myself. For being exactly who you are." Connor pulled her into his arms, and Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart that had become the rhythm of her own life. "You do not need to thank me," he said softly. "Loving you has been the easiest and best thing I have ever done. You are my heart, Sarah. You and our children. Everything good in my life comes from you." They stood there together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and had built something extraordinary from that first meeting. Sarah's hands, which had once bled from overwork and desperation, were now held gently in Connor's hands, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, inside the cabin. She could hear the children laughing and arguing and being their normal, chaotic selves. Tomorrow there would be work to do, meals to cook, lessons to teach, animals to care for, all the endless tasks that made up a life. But tonight, in this moment, there was only peace and love and the profound satisfaction of knowing that she had survived her darkest days and emerged into light. Connor had bandaged her bleeding hands all those years ago, but he had done so much more than that. He had bandaged her wounded heart, her damaged spirit, her broken faith in the possibility of happiness. He had made sure she rested not just her body but her soul, giving her the time and space and safety to heal properly and completely. And in return, she had given him everything she had: her love, her loyalty, her trust, her whole self. They went inside together as the last light faded from the sky, ready to make supper and settle the children and begin another evening in the life they had built together. And Sarah knew, with the kind of deep certainty that requires no proof, that she would be grateful for this life and this man and this family every single day for the rest of her days. Years continued to flow by like the streams that ran down from the high peaks, marking time with their steady progress. Carl grew into a young man of 18, tall and strong like his father, with Connor's skill in the wilderness and Sarah's thoughtful nature. He had begun making trips to town on his own to trade furs and sell horses, showing the same business sense that Connor had developed over the years. Susan, at 15, had grown into a beautiful young woman who still loved books but had also learned practical skills from both parents, equally comfortable baking bread or skinning a rabbit. The twins, Thomas and Jack, were 10 years old and already showing signs of the men they would become. Thomas was quieter and more introspective, while Jack was adventurous and bold, but they were inseparable despite their different temperaments. One evening in late summer, with the whole family gathered around the table for supper, Carl made an announcement. "I have been thinking," he said, glancing at his father. "I would like to start my own trap lines next winter, maybe build my own cabin a few valleys over. I am old enough now, and I have learned everything you could teach me." Sarah felt her heart clench with the knowledge that her firstborn was ready to leave, but she also felt pride in the capable young man he had become. She looked at Connor, whose expression showed the same mixture of emotions. "You are ready," Connor said after a moment, his voice steady though Sarah could hear the emotion underneath. "You are more than ready, and a few valleys over is close enough that we will still see each other regularly." "I will help you build your cabin," Thomas offered eagerly. "I am strong enough to help now." "Me too," Jack added, not wanting to be left out. Susan was quieter, but she reached over and squeezed Carl's hand. "I will miss you," she said simply, "but I am happy for you too." After supper, as Sarah and Connor prepared for bed, they talked about Carl's announcement. "It is hard to let him go," Sarah admitted, "even though I know he is ready and this is natural and right." "He is not going far," Connor reminded her gently. "And he is strong and capable because of how we raised him. That is something to be proud of, Sarah." "I am proud," Sarah said. "So proud of all of them. They are good children, good people." Connor pulled her into his arms and she relaxed against him as she had done countless times over their years together. "We did well," he said softly. "You and I. We built something good here, something that will last beyond us." Sarah thought about that, about the legacy they were creating not just in their children, but in the values they had taught them. Hard work balanced with rest, determination tempered with kindness, strength combined with gentleness. She thought about how different her life could have been if Connor had not stopped to help a bleeding girl behind a boarding house in Julesburg all those years ago. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I will love you forever, Connor Vaughn." "And I love you," Connor replied, his arms tightening around her. "Forever and beyond, Sarah Vaughn." The following spring, they all worked together to build Carl's cabin in a valley 3 miles from their own. It was smaller than the main cabin but solidly constructed, and Carl had chosen a beautiful location near a creek with good access to his trap lines. When it was finished, Sarah helped him set up housekeeping, providing linens and dishes and all the small things that turned a building into a home. "You will visit often?" she asked as she arranged jars of preserved food in his new cupboard. "Every week," Carl promised, "and you are all welcome here anytime. This is still family, Mother, just in a different location." Sarah hugged him tightly, this son who was taller than she was now, this young man who carried so much of both his parents in his features and character. "I am so proud of you," she said. "Your grandfather would have been proud too." Life continued in its steady rhythm, with seasons marking time more reliably than any clock. Susan began keeping company with a young rancher she met on one of the family's trips to Julesburg, a respectful young man named David Harper, who Connor approved of after careful scrutiny. The twins grew into their teenage years, becoming more responsible and helpful around the homestead. When Sarah was 43 years old and Connor was 48, they became grandparents for the first time. Carl married a sweet girl named Emma, who he had met in town, and 9 months later they had a daughter. Carl brought his wife and baby daughter to meet the family on a crisp autumn afternoon, and Sarah held her granddaughter with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Her name is Caroline," Carl said, smiling at his parents, "after both of her grandfathers. Caroline Sarah Vaughn." Sarah looked down at the tiny face of her granddaughter and felt the circle of life completing itself in a way that was both profound and deeply satisfying. This baby would never know the desperation and exhaustion that Sarah had experienced as a young woman. This baby would grow up surrounded by love and security, with parents who valued her for who she was rather than what she could produce. That was a legacy worth building. Over the next few years, more grandchildren arrived. Susan and David married and had 2 sons. The twins, as they entered their 20s, both built cabins near Carl's and started families of their own. The family that had started with just Connor and Sarah had expanded into a small community spread across several valleys, all connected by blood and love and shared values. Sarah was 55 years old when she and Connor celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. The cabin that had once felt spacious now seemed small during family gatherings, but they had built an addition that served as a meeting hall of sorts where everyone could gather for holidays and special occasions. On their anniversary, all their children and grandchildren came together for a celebration, and the noise and chaos were beautiful to Sarah's ears. That evening, after everyone had left and it was just Connor and Sarah again in the quiet of their bedroom, they lay together in the darkness and reflected on their life together. Sarah's hair was streaked with silver now, and Connor's was mostly gray, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "No regrets?" Connor asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Sarah replied, as she always did. "You gave me everything, Connor." "A life I never dreamed was possible." "We gave each other everything," Connor corrected gently. "That is how love works, Sarah. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people choosing each other and building something together." Sarah thought about that, about the truth of his words. Yes, Connor had helped her in her darkest moment, had bandaged her hands and insisted she rest, had given her a way out of her desperate situation. But she had given him things too: companionship, love, a family, a home that was more than just a shelter. They had saved each other in equal measure. "Tell me again," she said softly. "Tell me about the first time you saw me." Connor pulled her closer, and she felt his smile against her hair. "I saw a girl chopping wood behind a boarding house," he said. "Her hands were wrapped in blood-soaked rags, but she kept working anyway. I saw determination and strength and a spirit that refused to break even under impossible circumstances. And I thought to myself, that is someone extraordinary. That is someone worth knowing. That is someone I could love for the rest of my life." "And you were right," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was right," Connor agreed. "Best judgment call I ever made." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, two people who had faced their own hardships and traumas and had found healing and wholeness together. The mountains stood silent and eternal around their cabin, witness to a love story that had started with bleeding hands and bandages, and had grown into something vast and enduring. As the years continued to advance, and they grew older together, Connor and Sarah remained active and engaged with their expanding family. Connor could no longer do the heavy physical work of his younger years, but he still trapped on a smaller scale and continued raising horses with help from his sons and grandsons. Sarah still gardened and cooked and kept house, but at a more relaxed pace, with plenty of time for reading and spending time with her grandchildren. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family, in a gathering so large they had to hold it outdoors even though it was November and cold. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Sarah, now 70 years old with hair gone completely silver, danced with Connor in front of everyone, their movements slower than they once were but no less full of love. 50 years, Connor said as they swayed together to the music. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Sarah said, looking up at him with eyes that still sparkled with the same intelligence and warmth they had held when she was 19. "Every single moment, good and bad, because it all led to this." They lived for many more years after that, growing old together with grace and dignity, their love remaining constant even as their bodies grew frail. When Connor finally passed away at the age of 84, peacefully in his sleep after a long and well-lived life, Sarah mourned him deeply, but without bitterness. She had been blessed with 59 years of marriage to the best man she had ever known, and she would carry that blessing in her heart for whatever time she had left. She lived for 3 more years after Connor's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, still sharp and engaged with the world even as her body grew weak. And when she finally passed away on a spring morning with the mountain wildflowers blooming outside her window, her last thoughts were of Connor and their first meeting behind a boarding house in Julesburg, of his gentle hands bandaging her wounds, of his firm insistence that she rest and heal. She had been the girl who worked until her hands bled, and he had been the mountain man who bandaged them and made sure she rested daily. From that simple act of kindness had grown a love that spanned nearly 6 decades, a family that spread across multiple generations, a legacy of strength and compassion that would endure long after both of them were gone. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery on a hillside near their cabin, with mountains rising all around and aspens rustling in the breeze. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them and tell stories of their love and their lives. And in that gathering, everyone agreed that Connor and Sarah Vaughn had lived well and loved deeply and left the world better than they found it. That, in the end, was the truest measure of a life well lived.